Yeah, so this is a pretty exciting event for us at the region of Waterloo. As everybody has been experiencing, the pandemic of COVID-19 has changed fundamentally the way that we are currently living and working in the region of Waterloo. It may be a temporary a change in the way our region is functioning, but there may be permanent implications. And so the pandemic has coincided with another important exercise that we're involved in, the review of our regional official plan. This policy document shapes the long-run future of the Waterloo region. It's a document which establishes our land use strategy. It helps shape infrastructure decisions. It directs how we will preserve the natural heritage and agricultural resources of our region. And in particular, it helps us all make decisions about where we invest and how we do so in order to build a more sustainable and livable region. And in the middle of all of that, with consultations, engagement of the public and already well underway, and COVID-19 came along and changed fundamentally the way that we operate in the region. So we were, Jean Andre and I had a conversation about whether or not it may be possible to harness some of the resources of the University of Waterloo to try and understand what the implications for the region might be. I'm really delighted with the outcome of that conversation. She was able to rally 13 research teams around the topics that you have before you today, and very quickly generate a series of white papers that explore some of these implications. Of course, the pandemic is continuing to evolve, and the way that the region responds to it is continuing to evolve. But we felt because we're working on a timeline with the regional official plan, it was incumbent upon us to pull in the best information from an external perspective that we can in order to understand the long-run implications. So I'm very excited about this. It's going to be a thought-provoking afternoon, and I really appreciate the University of Waterloo rallying around this important topic for us here in the region and for those of us that are participating from outside the region as well.
All right, thank you very much, Rod. Now over to you, Jean.
Okay, well, thank you. So on behalf of the University of Waterloo, I do want to thank the region for partnering with us in exploring the implications of COVID-19 for this community that we live in and we share in, and in particular for being able to help shape the official plan. As Rod said, he and I had a first conversation as COVID was still a relatively new phenomenon. It was in April. We spoke about the idea for this initiative. And after that conversation, I reached out to a few of my colleagues in the School of Planning, and they in turn suggested others. And I sent out an email to a number of people from 4 different faculties asking about their interest in participating. And I said, you have a chance to have an impact. There's a little bit of resources available for hiring a student, and you have a tight timeline. Are you in? And everyone said they were in very quickly. It was a bit like those wedding dances, where a few people start dancing and then each person goes and gets another. That was a bit how it happened. And I mention this because this kind of engagement on important questions, I think, speaks to the role of universities and to the changing roles. So I just want to share a moment or two of thought about the roles of universities. And I'm going to crib from an address that was given by one of the world's most famous sociologists, Manuel Castells. So Manuel Castells is a Spanish professor, although he's at University of Southern California. But as of January, I think of this year, he was asked to become the Minister of Universities in his home country of Spain, and in shaping the Spanish universities, 50 of them, for the future. And he's written about what the role of universities are. And I just want to say a few of these as a way of framing the things that our colleagues are going to talk about today. So he says there's sort of 6 roles. The first one is universities started out as a producer of values, and he makes reference to the linkages between the early universities and the religions, whether you're talking about the first universities in Italy or Morocco. I think, people debate where the first university was. The second, he says, is that there was the role of the university was to establish a social stratification, an elite of type. And in fact, still today, he notes that many of the leaders of our world, both business and in the political world, have graduated from just a very small number of universities. This is the creation of the elite, if you like. He talks about a third function, which is the training of the labor force, looking in particular at professions like medicine and engineering, computer science, law. And then he talks about how in the late 1800s and early 1900s, something else began to happen, that universities began to take on that role of discovery. And so here we get the universities that are research intensive or science focused. And then the fifth role he talks about is about educating the masses. And then he talks about a sixth, which I'll just mention in a moment. But in the first 5, you'll recognize that in the public Canadian institutions that you know and you love, perhaps, some of those functions remain and others have more or less faded away. Now, the sixth role, he says, which I think links to today, is that he talks about the entrepreneurial university. And that's the university that connects the world of science and technology with business and with policy. And he talks about Stanford and MIT as examples. But certainly for those of you who are on the call from the University of Waterloo, you'll also recognize the kind of way we've come to think about ourselves, at least to some extent. And I think it's in this last phase, which is most exciting, because what it really says is that the university must be relevant in looking at the questions that matter for society. I think how we plan our communities matters. And so I'm really happy to have our people here sharing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean. In terms of the structure for our symposium today, basically as I mentioned, we're going to have a series of presentations under each of the 4 theme areas. There's a variety of presenters, as you can see from the agenda. And what I really want to stress to our audience, and there's some over 150 people participating today, is that we really value your questions today. Both the region values these questions, and this session is being recorded. So it's really important to get your perspective and your thoughts on what you're hearing in terms of the impacts of COVID-19 in the region and moving forward. But also the researchers really appreciate having different perspectives on their work as they present it. They're hungry for that kind of feedback as it'll help them refine the final products that they're going to produce for the region. So I really would encourage the audience to use the question and answer function within Zoom. And I'll be monitoring that as I go through the presentations. And then when we have the Q&A period, I'll basically be engaging those questions with each of the presenters and their teams of researchers. So that's how we're going to roll through things today. I'm just trying to remember where I focused my eyeballs. I didn't focus them in the right location to see how we're doing for timing. The timing, I know, again, there might be people joining the call partway through or leaving if you've got to take a break and come back. We're going to do our absolute best to try and stay on the time schedule within that we've organized. And I think you can maybe appreciate that we'll probably be able to use up time and get back on track if people go a little bit longer in some of their presentations. Not that academics are known to get long-winded, but that may happen on occasion. So without further ado, and hopefully I didn't forget anything in terms of the usual organizational beginning comments, but it's going to be an interesting experience this afternoon. I really encourage you to, again, engage as best you can through the Q&A, and we'll get things rolling without further ado. So I'm going to invite...
Sorry, if I can just interrupt very quickly, I apologize. I just wanted, we never mentioned that we are recording the session. So for those that are on the call, just please be aware that we are recording the session and it will be available on the YouTube channel for the region of Waterloo following the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I forgot to mention that as well. Okay, so without further ado, then let's get into our first subject area, which deals with the economy and work. All of us have been impacted, obviously, economically and through our work, I'm sure. So I'd like to ask our first presenter, Tara Vinadre, to lead us off.
Perfect. Thank you, Clarence. I'm delighted to present today a piece of research that really represents a team effort between myself, Marcus Moses, the Director of Planning at the University of Waterloo, and our fantastic team of Waterloo planning students, and especially David Adama, who conducted a really substantial amount of the background research and data collection that goes into what you'll see today. And this work is part of a broader project that Marcus Moses and I have been working on over the last several years, where we've been very concerned with the intersection of housing and economic development and its impact on what we call new economy cities. We think that's of particular relevance to a place like the region of Waterloo, which has had a very strong presence in tech, which has been, one of the places where we're seeing a lot of change and shift in this sort of immediate part of the pandemic, and has been really a key driver of the regional economy. And so over the past few months, and if I can have the next slide, please, over the last few months, we've really been paying attention to the larger debate about the future of cities and what it means when firms make different decisions about how they structure work and how they structure their innovation processes and where they're going to locate those activities. And so this is a bigger debate about the future of cities. And we want to sort of remind our audience that there's a lot more nuance to this than what you might see in the news. And I sort of put up here sort of the two different announcements, competing announcements by the one very big and central company, Facebook, which on the one hand announced that they were going to shift a larger portion of their work to remote locations, which can be done remotely, but at the same time is doubling down on investment in cities as places of work, as places to have offices. And this is sort of seen across the tech sector. And we have to ask questions about whether the tech is the canary in the coal mine for what might happen in a post-pandemic future. And what we want to emphasize is that this is a much more complex question, and it's not going to be all one or all the other. And we want to kind of dig into some of that. And we think it's especially relevant in mid-sized communities or regions like the region of Waterloo that may not be as large as New York and London, which are benefiting from places like Facebook, companies like Facebook and Google announcing that they will continue to expand offices in those locations. They're much smaller. And so the question is, what happens in these mid-sized dynamic regions, much like the one that what most of us are living and working in at the moment. And so this is where we're at. So the next slide actually sort of grounds this bigger debate in this very region itself. And very early on in the pandemic, Shopify was one of the first Canadian companies, one of the first tech companies to announce that it was going to shift to remote work until at least 2021, and was in fact thinking about doing this on a much more permanent basis. And of course, this raises questions, particularly for a place like Waterloo, which has just seen an expansion of this very company in the region and into downtown office spaces. So it really raises questions about what this might mean for this region. But we want to contrast that story with another tech story in the region, a tech startup story of Inksmith, which was an ed tech company that's been now very well storied in the Canadian media around their pivot from doing 3D printing and making for educational technologies, and very quickly and in a very short amount of time shifted into the production of PPE and did so in a way that has generated a large number of mid-skill jobs and has generated employment. And that employment can't be done remotely because it's manufacturing work. And this, of course, reflects the sort of two stories of this region. One, where we see a sort of very strong industrial past that's now coming to bear on the post-pandemic urban future of this region. And if I can have my next slide, please. So this summer, we sort of set out to sort of really understand this puzzle around what's going to happen to the dynamics of an urban economy like the region of Waterloo. And so what we want to do is sort of take these broader trends and ground them in the experience of this region and sort of think through what this might mean longer term for a place like the Kitchener-Waterloo region. So we looked at the academic literature, we looked at sort of a lot of the industry and policy reports coming out. We thought it important to ground some of that in an empirical understanding of the region, and we sort of took a pre-pandemic snapshot, looking at what's the industrial structure of this region, what's growing, what's shrinking, what's happening right now or pre-pandemic in terms of where people were already working, were they working from home, and what kinds of commuting patterns were related to those sectors. Because I think, again, it's about this nuance. It's sort of a large region. There's a lot of different kinds of economic activity, and we have to consider that whole bucket, even as we watch one of the key sectors really shifting in a particular direction. And so in our work, because it's part of a larger SSHRC funded project, we're very interested in both sort of this tech piece and traditional manufacturing. And this, of course, aligns well with a strong history in this region of economic development strategies that have in fact emphasized the importance of these sectors for the economic competitiveness and growth of the region. And can I have my next slide, please? So looking at the literature, we sort of really teased out there are three key areas in which we can sort of think about the region being vulnerable if there are shifts and changes. And so we sort of structured this around three ideas. The first is that there's an industrial structure to the region, or what we call sector specialization. And we do know that communities or regions that have particular cluster strengths, economic strengths, they can be therefore vulnerable to shocks inside of those, right? And so in a region like Waterloo, there's a strong, and I'll show this in a minute, there's a very strong manufacturing sector that's very, very concentrated. There's a strong tech sector. It attracts talent in, and a lot of the economic development strategy has been about attracting both firms and people to work in those places. And of course, with the shift to remote work, we have to ask the question, how do we have to change our strategies around that piece? And are we aware of the kind of vulnerabilities that might exist as global supply chains shift and move? And we were particularly thinking here about what happens in medical devices and in other industries that have suddenly become of strategic and domestic importance at sort of the national level. And what region, is there an opportunity with these sort of two strengths that the region has in manufacturing and tech to really take hold of that? And I think there is, and the Inksmith / Canadian Shield example speaks to that. The other question is about what happened, or the second thing is about remote work and the shifts around the work dynamics in an innovation economy. We certainly think there's this a risk around the demand for office space. We also see that there's a question about how innovation happens, and there are short and long-term impacts and trade-offs there. Certainly in the short term, everyone has moved remotely who are working in these innovation sectors, but there are important exchanges that can happen that require face-to-face contact. And we were speaking to Dean Andre's point earlier about discovery. A lot of discovery happens in labs, and those are physical settings. They require people to be in particular places. So again, we need to think about what kinds of industrial structures require people to be in particular workplaces, rather than just people who can sit at home and type on their computer. And what's lost if we shift completely to remote work? Related to that point, there are both organizational and network effects that are sort of longer term. And this is, the literature talks a lot about this, who gets excluded. I think when we hear the presentation from Professor Worth later, we'll hear more about some of the challenges associated with working from home. And again, we think about the commuting patterns of various sectors of work. And the final point here is about institutions. And here's a place where Waterloo has really shone in, and been able to adapt in previous, when there's been previous sort of bumps and changes in the economy, and has demonstrated key resilience. And it's because of the strength of local institutions. I think that's an important point to raise here. I can have a next slide. I'm going to go through the data very quickly. This slide is just to demonstrate the strengths of the region. Anything in the top right corner are things where there's a strong concentration of employment. It's large and it's growing, right? And so I think here we can see both manufacturing, medical devices, automotive, these are manufacturing sectors, IT, this is the tech piece, and some other kinds of office work. And we're not going to be able to talk, like I said, in a very short period of time, 10 minutes. We can't talk about all of the different dynamics at work, but we emphasize that it's important to recognize this industrial diversity in planning for a post-COVID, post-pandemic economy. If I can have my next slide, please. We also looked, and we certainly don't expect you to memorize this entire slide, but we wanted to emphasize that this is sorted top to bottom in terms of the proportion of employment in the region by sector. We wanted to emphasize again that currently, or pre-pandemic, there were varying rates of people working from home on a regular basis. We wanted to emphasize diversity in how much transit was being used and how much active transportation was being used. And we also wanted to compare this, then Statistics Canada started to look at the telework capacity of different sectors. And so we put this sort of together as a bit of, as sort of the pieces of a puzzle to try and understand, we sort of project out where might those big impacts be in terms of land use, in terms of the dynamics around work. and where an economic development strategy could really smartly target to think about how these things intersect. And one of the things that comes out in this is that you can see that public transportation is used by sectors that are often very low wage. And so we need to think about the equity pieces as well. And we're going to get into all of this. This sort of comes out in more detail in our white paper. And if I can have the next slide, please. I have about a minute left, and I just want to highlight again with the Inksmith story, that there are key local institutions that really allowed, and they're public institutions that allowed it to pivot that quickly. And they are in some cases unusual suspects, right? So public libraries were important, maker spaces were important. And then the things we usually expect, public universities, the local tech association, and the role of public procurement. So we want to really emphasize there's a very strong public infrastructure, most of it local, but other layers on as well, that make a transition for this company and potentially others possible that might generate mid-skilled jobs in a post-pandemic future. If I can have my last slide. We really want to emphasize at the end of the day that the pandemic is amplifying and accelerating existing trends. And it's not really, in some cases it's shifting and creating new opportunities, but there's a lot that's still there, that's new, but is building on an existing base of economic activity. And so our advice based on what we've done to date would be to really invest strategically in local institutions and consider the role of social infrastructure, whether that be the public libraries that sort of became a surprise important local asset, or others. We see the role of daycares and schools right now as being a rather critical piece of infrastructure to allow people to work, and also really thinking carefully about how to anchor talent and firms in a context where we've often thought about the University of Waterloo as attracting and then being able to retain that talent in a remote situation that maybe have to be rethought as to how we're going to do that. And finally, we would just emphasize that there's a big equity and inclusion question that really needs to be thought through. We've seen very clearly that the role of the pandemic has been to accentuate those inequalities, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. Fascinating to look at the regional economy. We're going to transition now to the second speaker presentation in this particular theme. And I'd like to welcome my colleague, Joel Blitt, please.
Hi, so thank you for inviting me to speak today. So my talk is going to be about how COVID-19 is going to impact the future of work. So basically the labor market. And I want to mention that, so some of this work I'm going to be presenting today, it's forthcoming in Canadian public policy. So if you want to read more about it, there's a link there, and also feel free to get in touch with me. I also want to say thanks to Keksuan and Chuanmo for their fantastic help getting data, etc. Okay, so fundamentally, I'm interested in looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on the labor market, and we can divide it into the immediate impacts and the longer term impacts. And the immediate impacts are fairly obvious, right? So the first thing that happened between February and April, there were 5.5 million jobs that were either lost or whose hours were reduced by 50% or more. Disproportionately also, the most financially vulnerable were impacted in these job losses. And what we've seen since April is a recovery, or a partial recovery. I think we've now regained about 50% of those lost jobs, but it's been uneven. And so some people have gone back to work much faster than others. And so one much publicized group is parents with young children have obviously been having a harder time getting back into the workforce, and especially mothers. So if we can, in the next slide, this is a snapshot. So here I'm just plotting employment per capita on the vertical axis over the last 10 years. And what you can see is that it was really steady. And then all of a sudden, as of February 2020, it basically dropped off the face of a cliff. It has since recovered a little bit. So it recovered a little bit. So the trough was in April. It recovered a little bit by May. It recovered a lot by June, and a little bit more by July. Okay, so now about 50% of the drop has been recovered. But what we're also seeing is that the recovery is slowing down. And specifically, economists believe that we're not going to get back to pre-crisis levels until the end of 2021. So basically a year from now or more. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that we're in the midst of a real recession. So while the shutdown was self-imposed, while these job losses were self-imposed, we can't just remove the shutdown and go back to normal. We have pretty much removed the shutdown, but we're going to be struggling with this for a long time. Okay, so we're in the midst of a real recession. That's the key message. So next slide. And so that leads me to talking about what this paper is really about, which is what are going to be the long run implications of COVID-19. And so specifically what I believe, I'm going to try and convince you that the long run implications are that we're going to see a lot of automation and reallocation during this COVID-19 period. And so to be clear, what do I mean by automation? What I mean is changes within firms such that firms are adopting new technologies to replace workers. So whether it's software, robots, or better, more efficient processes or anything of that sort. What reallocation means, it's changes across firms, changes between firms. And so specifically, the less productive, less automated firms are going to be losing market share and are going to be losing resources. And those are going to be going to the more productive, more highly automated firms. Okay, so that's the reallocation process. Now, both automation within firms and reallocation between firms results in the same thing. It results in an economy that's more productive, and it also results in a large number of jobs that are going to be lost. So why am I claiming that this is what's going to happen with COVID-19? Well, what I did was I went back and looked at previous history. So if we can move on to the next slide. And what the previous history shows is pretty clear. Okay, so what am I showing here? So again, on the vertical axis, I have employment per capita. And I've divided employment by routine jobs and non-routine jobs. And what you can see is that non-routine jobs over the last 30 years have been going up. Non-routine jobs, on the other hand, have been going down. Okay, so this is basically since about 1985, 1987, which coincides roughly with the beginning of the ICT revolution, of the information communications technology revolution. It turns out that the pattern I'm going to show you here in a second was not true before the beginning of the ICT revolution, which also lends credence to the arguments that I'm making. And so what we see is that this drop in in routine jobs over the last 30 years was not consistent. As a matter of fact, it's only over 20% of this time period that pretty much all of these routine jobs were lost. What is that 20% of the time period? Well, it's the area shaded in gray. Those are the 3 recessions that we have suffered since 1987. And I mean, I personally find this picture shocking. It's like clockwork, right? So the number of routine jobs are pretty steady. You're going along, you hit a recession, and the number of routine jobs just drops like a stone. And then it pretty much stabilizes again, a little bit of up and down here, but it hits the next recession and it again drops like crazy. And it keeps doing exactly that. If we can move on to the next slide. So this is just zooming in on these 3 different recessions that I was just mentioning. And you see the exact same thing, right? So what you see is non-routine jobs are generally not affected during recessions. Routine jobs take a big hit. And the key that we see here is that they never recover. So the routine jobs that are lost during recessions never come back. Why is that? Because they're being automated away or they're being reallocated. Okay, so this is what I think we're going to see during COVID-19. Now, the key question, of course, is COVID-19 going to be different? So so next slide. So it is going to be different, but I think it's going to be different in the sense that the impact on automation and reallocation is going to be even bigger. First of all, this is a much bigger recession than any previous recession that we've seen, at least in recent memory, especially since, relative to the last 2. But secondly, on top of the usual recessionary incentives and pressures to automate, to reallocate, there are now health incentives to automate and reallocate that are being superimposed on top of those recessionary pressures. And so now we actually have two big, huge forces working together towards automation and reallocation. So what are these health incentives? Well, in terms of automation, imagine that you're a firm and you know that you've got certain operations which you don't want to be shut down. Well, the biggest risk of your operations are your people. So either A, they can get sick, or B, the government imposes a shutdown. Well, how are you going to mitigate those risks? And how are you going to protect your workers at the same time? Well, the way you're going to do it is you're going to try and minimize worker-to-worker interaction, and you're going to try and put in more worker-to-robot or worker-to-computer interactions. You're basically going to try and replace workers with machines. And the more workers you replace with machines, the more you're going to mitigate these risks to your operations. In terms of reallocation, we can also make a similar story. There's going to be firms that are going to be less automated. Those firms are probably going to suffer more disruption to the operations with people getting sick or the government imposing a shutdown. And when that happens, they're either going to lose market share or potentially might even go bankrupt altogether. And those resources, that market share, are going to be going to more automated firms. Okay, so again, these health incentives are going to superimpose on top of the usual recessionary pressures to really create a huge economic transformation, automation, reallocation during the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm hoping I've largely convinced you that we are going to see a really big effect. The next question we can ask is, well, what industries in what industries are we going to see the biggest effects? And so I'm going to focus on these health incentives for a second. And we can think, okay, well, what industries are we going to see that workers, that there's a big risk to workers? Well, it's going to be those industries where workers are working very closely to other workers, where the average worker is in close proximity to other workers. So if we can go on to the next slide. So here what I'm plotting on the vertical axis is for each of these different industries, what is the extent of physical proximity that workers require to work in those areas? So for example, in healthcare, people work very close to other people, but also in education, in hotels, in food services, and in retail trade. But where healthcare and retail trade are very different is in the degree to which automation is possible. So how feasible is automation? And so I've also plotted on the horizontal axis the fraction of workers in routine occupations that are doing routine jobs. And so the key difference here is that retail trade and healthcare might have similar incentives to automate, but retail trade is able to feasibly automate because a lot of the jobs are routine. And so what are the 4 big areas that are most automatable? Well, it would be the areas in the top right? So it'd be retail trade, construction, manufacturing, and transportation and warehousing. So what does that mean for the region of Waterloo? Well, we can look at it in 2 ways. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we can look at it from the point of view of occupation. So it turns out that in the KWCMA, 44% of workers are working in routine occupations. That's actually quite high. It means that a good chunk of us are at risk of being automated away. That compares, so that's pretty high compared to the Canadian average, which is 38%. In the next slide, we can look at this from the perspective of industry. And again, as Tara was showing, manufacturing is the biggest employer in the region, followed by retail trade, followed by healthcare, et cetera. So I've ranked them in terms of size of employment. And what you see is that our 2 biggest employers are 2 of the 4 industries that are at the highest risk of significant automation during this transformation. In the interest of time, I won't go into the details. If we can go to the next slide. So what does this all mean? Well, the first key point here is I think that we don't talk enough, and policymakers are not aware enough. We don't talk about it enough in the popular press, et cetera, that COVID-19 is going to create a very large transformation of our economy through automation and reallocation. I think this is going to be one of the enduring legacies. Waterloo region itself is going to be disproportionately affected. Now, is this a good or bad thing? Well, it's a little bit of both. I'd say it's mostly a good thing. So the transformation should be encouraged. So for example, the current wage subsidy that we still have at the federal level, I think needs to be scrapped relatively soon because it's actually stifling this transformation that needs to take place. So this transformation is going to make us richer. This is a fantastic thing. But the key thing we have to remember is that the benefits and costs are going to be unevenly distributed. And so this becomes a policy issue. We have to make sure that everyone benefits from the transformation and not just a few. The one silver lining that I see that I want to end with here is I see increased solidarity in the public, among fellow Canadians, and an increased belief in the role of government. And I think this presents a historic opportunity to reimagine our social contract, our social safety nets, to make sure that all Canadian benefit from this technological change and from future crises to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. The final presentation in our opening theme area on economy and work is going to be delivered by Professor Nancy Worth. So, Nancy.
Thanks very much. So I'm Nancy Worth, a faculty member in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management. You'll also hear from my co-author, PhD candidate Alkim Karadzic. So at the end of May, the front page of the Globe and Mail proclaimed 2020 as the year the office died. And on the very same day, the National Post declared the office is over. But is this true? And what would this mean for the workers in the region of Waterloo? So our white paper examines the impact of changing work arrangements in the context of COVID-19. So a work arrangement involves where people work, how many hours they work, and their schedules. And our paper just focuses on that first part, the challenges and opportunities of where people work. And we're emphasizing an equity lens. An equity lens is really vital for two reasons. First, it helps make policies that address the needs of those who are most affected by this pandemic and its economic impacts. And two, considering equity helps the region be more resilient to cope with future crises. So Alcim's going to start us off here with workers who can't work from home. Alcim, over to you.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, so long before the pandemic, studies on telecommuting in Canada had already shown that about 60% of jobs are not compatible with remote working. So we've grouped those who can't work from home into the essential and non-essential workers. So the essential labor force, more known as frontline workers, are majority employed in high-touch services such as healthcare, grocery stores, delivery services, where remote work is impossible. The second category is workers in wholesale and retail trade, accommodation and food services, and the hospitality industry, who have experienced some of the largest employment declines over the first 2 months of the lockdown. So as these sectors are dominated by hourly paid, part-time and majority unprotected work, these workers might not be getting called back to their jobs in the post-pandemic era. So the takeaway here is that not being able to work from home is precarious, as non-essential workers face unemployment and essential frontline workers risk their health and the health of those around them. So we looked at the consequences of changing work arrangements for those who can't work from home in 3 areas. The first is sectoral inequalities. So essential services are not limited to the functions performed by frontline workers. That means there is a wider group of workers in sectors such as sanitation, food production, and maintenance, and construction, where invisible, on-demand, and mostly unprotected essential work persists. So the majority minimum wage migrant workers in these sectors are more vulnerable to outbreaks and infections due to fewer resources and language barriers. So recent reports on agricultural production, for example, reveal that migrant workers are less likely to socially distance and receive decent food, income, or health information during quarantine while their work has intensified. So the second area is inequalities in care economy. So COVID-19 has revealed how important care work is to society, yet how undervalued it is. So women are on the front lines of the pandemic. As we know, like 81% of the healthcare and social assistant workforce is made up of women. Many care workers who face extreme vulnerabilities during the crisis, yet are racialized women. Also, asylum seekers make up of a large portion of the personal support workers in nursing and homes across Canada. So during the pandemic, they keep working in multiple facilities, risking job losses and deportation if they get sick. So therefore, a more socially just economic recovery requires acknowledging and prioritizing the well-being of the essential workers, those behind the scenes, as much as the people who benefit from their care. So finally, the third is gender-based inequalities, remain shaping the work landscape both during the economic shutdown as well as the recovery. So women are more likely to be left to choose between care responsibilities at home and securing income. So the figure here shows that employment losses both among men and women were more severe in hourly paid jobs, with losses in working hours are more common among hourly paid women. Moreover, women who lost the majority of their usual work hours were the ones with children under age 6, suggesting childcare, homeschooling, and domestic work are still considered as primarily women's responsibility during COVID-19. So moving forward in June, was more advanced among men and slowest for women with school-age children. So with the reopening of yet childcare is unavailable, women are still more likely to lose their jobs. dropping out of the labor force. So that means we should consider gender-conscious recovery programs, ensuring access to safe, affordable, and high-quality care. So I'll leave it to Nancy here to continue with working from home. Thank you.
Thanks, Alkem. I've got the work from home section. So before the pandemic, few Canadians work from home. Our best measure is about 13% of employees were in jobs where any of their scheduled hours could be work from home. And that's important. It's not that 13% of jobs were working from home, it's any of their scheduled hours. But by the end of March, just a few weeks into the pandemic, 40% of Canadians were working from home, and presumably for all of their hours, as most offices were closed. So within a few weeks of the start of the pandemic, Canadians reached the estimated maximum capacity of work from home potential of the labor market at 40%. So as Alkem was saying earlier, 60% of workers cannot work from home, and this work from home workforce maxes out at 40%. Workers who were able to work from home are more likely to be salaried rather than hourly employees. They're also more likely to be highly educated and highly paid. And as a result, these workers were the least likely to lose their jobs due to COVID-19 and were the fastest to bounce back to near normal employment by June. The key takeaway here is that the flexibility of being able to work from home is a privilege, allowing workers to maintain both employment and personal health. So we've identified 3 areas of consideration for those who can work from home. And the first is cost. At the outset, there's a significant cost involved in setting up or improving a home office space, which includes setting up the technology of virtual meetings like this, as well as making the physical space suitable for full-time hours. Right now, I'm speaking to you from a dining room table, as probably many of the panelists are today. And while some employers are granting credits to purchase office furniture and computers, this is not a universal practice. The biggest savings for work from home of both time and money involves commuting. Yet savings in Waterloo region may be small, as we already have the second shortest commute in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, with most commuters living within 10 kilometers of their workplaces. The second issue we identified is the issue of work-life balance. So a popular lament you may have seen circulating on Twitter lately is that we're not working from home, we're living at work. And what research has found is that productivity often increases in work from home arrangements, but often in ways that are damaging to workers, such as workers who take fewer breaks when they work from home. Or some workers work more due to a fear of unemployment, what's been termed recently a fear-based productivity, especially notable at the beginning of the pandemic when people weren't sure what jobs would continue. But it's important to mention that for some workers, working from home offers much needed flexibility. In one of the most famous work from home studies that really tried to measure the impact of whether work from home arrangements would be long lasting into the future, the travel agency C-Trip experimented with sending workers home to work or having them work in the office. And after the experiment, they gave their workers the choice, and half wanted to return and half wanted to stay home. So it's a really complex picture in terms of what work-life balance offers in the work from home space. And echoing Alkem's final point, my third consideration is around care responsibilities defaulting to women. So similar to the gendered impacts of those who can't work from home, there's a gendered inequality to work from home arrangements as well. So while Collins et al. In some recent research surmised that the transition to work from home might make invisible domestic and caring labor more obvious to fathers, according to US data collected before and during the pandemic, for dual earner couples able to work from home, mothers with young children have reduced their work hours 4 to 5 times more than fathers. Consequently, the gender gap in work hours has grown 20 to 50% for those working from home with young children. We conclude our paper with some suggestions about how to support the economic recovery of those who can't work from home and those adjusting to the new normal of the home office. In particular, we emphasize childcare and elder care as important social infrastructures that support economic growth, as well as opportunities to keep highly skilled workers in the region. And we'll end it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nancy. we now have the opportunity to engage in a bit of a Q&A session with the three different presenters or presentations that we've heard thus far on this topic of economy and work, in the region. So to begin with, I've got a question from the Q&A forum for Tara and Marcus in terms of their work. And that question relates to, I guess, the role of technology and the question of equity and access in terms of how it impacts the different communities within the region. So technology as being something that is very much an influence on equity, i.e. not everyone has access to the technology and can participate in that part of the economy. Is that something that you examined within the context of your work?
Marcus, do you want to jump in or do you want me to go ahead?
Go ahead, Tara.
Okay, perfect. So, I mean, what we were looking at really is more industrial structure, right? And employment and those kinds of questions. So, the access to technology piece, and of which there's a large literature on the digital divide around those things, is of less concern in this particular piece, because we were interested in the tech sector as an industry in and of itself. And we were interested in how its, locational calculus is shifting and what they're thinking about in terms of those things. And we do have some concerns around that. Particularly, we know that the tech sector has faced in the longer run real questions around diversity and inclusion. When things shift into an online environment, often what happens is those challenges are amplified. And I think that speaks particularly to the same kinds of arguments that Nancy and Alkim are making as well about who may be included or excluded in this shift. And so that's the concern there. But we really didn't really address head on the question of the underlying technologies which have facilitated the shift to remote work in some areas of the economy. But I think what's actually important is to remember the point made by Nancy and Alkim, that in fact there's a very large proportion of work, and the same statistic shows up in ours as well, in terms of the capacity of particular forms of work to even be conducted remotely, right? So I think that's an important piece to bear in mind, that there's still a large part of the economy that happens in real places and in bricks and mortar structures. And even when it's happened remotely, it's still doing that, it's just in a different place, right? So.
Sure. In your work at all, and maybe again in your conversations, I mean, a lot of emphasis pre-COVID on the sort of Waterloo-Toronto sort of tech corridor. How is your perspective on that, having gone through the project that you just completed, in terms of especially the long view, right, the 2041 view?
Right, and I think this is here, there's a question about, which we sort of raised, about whether or not this question of talent attraction is going to matter in the same way, or how it might matter. And in fact, if you think about what we ended up concluding, is in fact that it's sort of doubling down on ensuring that there's an infrastructure in place, and that includes social infrastructure that might allow a region like Waterloo to continue to attract talent to those industries, and if they are being conducted remotely, even if work is still remote. That will be a necessary piece of what has to happen. There's questions about the housing market. I think Marcus is in a better position to answer those or to address those than I am, but there's a housing price piece. And I think there continues to be a question about connectivity along that corridor. And that I don't think that question is going away, thinking through both the shorter and the longer term. And I think the innovation questions are important in this as well. What we do know is that there's an enormous amount of benefit to those sort of random encounters that help with problem solving, industrial problem solving, whether it be in tech or in other forms of economic activity. And while the short-term view is all this remote work is great, even in sector, even in these sort of that 40% of work that can be done at home, but there are some economic losses and productivity losses in the longer run. And in fact, the productivity question is important here too, is very uneven. Finance, the productivity has increased. Other sectors of the economy, that's not been true. So there's a lot of assumptions that are made about the benefit of this, of remote work that I think are much more complicated and complex on the ground.
Yeah, and certainly perspectives on remote work have evolved over the last 3 or 4 months as well, right? It's like if you look at polls and responses to things, it's been
yes.
Yeah.
Depends on whether the kids are screaming in the background at that moment. Right?
Yeah, I hear you. A question for Joel related to maybe you could expand a little bit and give us some more examples on the distinctions between routine and non-routine jobs, and when is there a danger that some sort of non-routine jobs, depending on how technology evolves, may also become routine at some point in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me, before I answer that question, let me just add or agree with Tara. So I do a lot of work as well on looking at innovation and the extent to which geographical proximity really matters. And I think the pendulum has swung a little bit too far in the direction of, hey, we don't have to all be in the same place. We can all do remote working. The personal interactions are extremely important for innovation. I think in creative sectors, for coming up with new ideas, new projects, new anything, it's going to be extremely important. And I think all of these firms that are thinking that they can just send all of their workers remote and that, virtual meetings are going to have the same impact are really sort of missing they're missing the point that there's a flavor that can only be had through actual social interaction that you can't replicate online. And so I think the pendulum is going to swing back. It'll never go back to where we were before, but people are going to realize that physical interactions are important, and there will always be a hub for that. There has to be, especially in high-tech creative industries. So I agree with Tara completely. Okay, to the question about routine versus not routine. So the cop-out is go look at the paper where I actually define sort of what industries. It's done relatively roughly, and I've relied on how people have defined it in the past. But basically, a routine job is a job that is repetitive, that you can codify, right? That you can pretty easily say, you do this, then you do that, sort of discrete steps. So things like, obviously a manufacturing plant, so if we're working on a manufacturing line, if you're always doing the same thing to a widget, that would be routine. But also, if you're at a supermarket doing the checkout, that is also considered routine. And Walmart has already announced that they're getting, and at least one store, they're getting rid of all the checkout clerks, right? Because they think they don't need them anymore. So they're trying that. But it also goes to a bunch more areas. So for example, sales support, bookkeepers. There are all sorts of functions that are now being routinized by new technologies now. So, to Clarence's point, maybe the examples I gave were the routine jobs at the beginning. Now with AI, there's going to be way more things that are going to be routine, in quotation marks, that might not have been easy to automate in the past, but will be very soon. And one of the interesting things is that it used to be that it was relatively low skilled, or at the very end, occupations that were in the middle of the skill distribution that were routine and were hollowed out by the ICT revolution. But now that's changing because the new technologies, and AI in particular, are also affecting some of the higher end, traditionally white collar jobs. And so its impact on society, on wages, on inequality is going to be different. Although I still believe it'll be like the ICT revolution, that it's going to increase inequality.
Right, and a somewhat related question, Joel. Will the high rates of unemployment persist for the foreseeable future? And how do we, as a society, respond to or provide employment for those people that who lose their jobs and can't adapt to a new economy? So two double-barrel question there, sorry.
Yeah. So, okay, so let me answer this in two ways. So every time there's been a technological transformation, an innovative revolution, right? And the most recent one, of course, was the ICT revolution, but you can go back to the Industrial Revolution. The thing that happens in the short run is that people lose their jobs. And as economists, sometimes we dismiss that short run too quickly, and we say, well, eventually new industries spring up, and so we don't have to worry about this. Everyone will find new jobs in new industries, et cetera, right? We often dismiss it. The reality is that period in between where people lose their jobs and until new jobs spring up can sometimes be a really long time. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, real wages, so we all think of the Industrial Revolution as a good thing, but real wages didn't surpass pre-Industrial Revolution levels for 50 years after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. If you were joining the workforce at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you would not have said that it was a good thing because it wasn't for those workers. Okay, so there is going to be a lot of upheaval in the short run. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs, and that is a policy issue. I'm, for example, in favor of a guaranteed minimum income. But what I think is the even bigger issue is that in the middle to long run, it's going to increase inequality. So those people that have skills that are complementary to these technologies are going to benefit hugely. Their wages are going to go way up, which is exactly what we saw with the ICT revolution. That is, most economists think that is the biggest reason why inequality has been increasing over the last 30, 40 years. And those that have skills that are substitutable with the new technologies are going to lose their jobs and probably have to find jobs at lower wages in service sectors. And so that is a real worry, and one that we need to tackle from a policy perspective, right? We need to be able to tax. So more and more of the value creation is now algorithms and data and all these intangible assets that are really hard to tax. Labor is easy to tax. Those things you can set up in the Cayman Islands. So how are we going to tax those things that are generating the value and redistribute it to all of these Canadians and have a guaranteed minimum income, et cetera? I think this is a serious policy question, and it needs to be addressed multilaterally at the international level. And it's one of the things that keeps me up at night.
Thank you. So final question, and given our timing, I think this relates to Nancy's presentation around the people that were working from home early in the pandemic. Do we know a little bit more detail about sort of the sectors that they were involved in?
Sure. I guess across Tara's and Joel's presentations as well, it's those that in the knowledge economy most broadly that were able to make that shift really easily. People that were already working from home maybe a day a week or an afternoon a week that could leverage that flexibility into that permanent work from home arrangement. Those of us that might even have a home office they just moved into full time. I think what the real challenge is those that are on the edge of those transitions where the costs are really prohibitive, they don't have the space, the technology, and there is a real role for the region in terms of supporting those workers and workers that are sort of between the can work from home, can't work from home. So in our white paper, we talk about a couple of regions in Italy that are thinking about digital literacy and offering sort of digital toolboxes of resources for their most vulnerable citizens in terms of helping them make this transition, or even have some more services that are available to them in this new normal that happened in a few short weeks in terms of making the work from home space available to more people rather than these existing barriers that we have at the moment.
It's interesting. I was just going to ask you about, as you were doing your work, what was an example of a great case study that you saw where a community had made those kind of investments already? Beyond the Italian examples, or another one that comes to mind?
Well, I think just more broadly in terms of the debate between universal basic income and how do we support people in making those transitions, I'm actually more in favor of universal basic services as a way of supporting people in terms of free bus passes, free internet, and that allows work to really become something that is socially valued rather than something that is, well, we could have a longer debate about universal basic income, but I think universal basic services offers a real step forward in terms of supporting workers in all sectors of the labor market.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the audience watching, I just wanted to thank all three presenters in our first session, and thank you for the questions as well. Just as a reminder to the audience to keep the questions coming in. We may not have a chance to get to all of them. Some of them relate specifically to the presentation. Some of them are perhaps more of interest to the region, and not only is the session being recorded, but again, the question and answers and the questions are being recorded as well. So I just want to let you know that voice is being heard. So if we could move on to our next theme area, supporting the economy and work, of course, is infrastructure, and something